everyone. Welcome back to our session on European research projects. And I very glad to welcome five distinguished project coordinators that managed a lot of European projects in research and using lots of open source software. And so the session would be for 1 hour. So we will discuss various topics on open source in European research. So we will start with the open statement by the participants, right? And so then we'll go to discussions on like comments from the keynote, impact of the open source and so on. So with that, I'm going to get to the next speaker, who is Geir Horn, the head of European ICT project in Oslo from Norway. And he has actually prepared a nice presentation. So he has 3 to 5 minutes for his statement. Thank you, Geir, and you are now on.
Thank you very much, Andre, for the kind introduction. I'm going to be quick because we have not so much time here. So when we are building software, we can do just as much as this when we are building alone. I mean, we can build some kind of a small hut for ourselves, but when we come together, we can do much more. But if we come together, we need some kind of a structure, and this is the main message I have here, because we cannot really just go on building on our own. So we need architects and we need a strategy for what we're going to build, and then coming together we can build something like this. And furthermore, I mean, today it is possible for the Chinese to put up a whole hospital in just a few days in Wuhan when the COVID hit there. So the point is that today we have the pleasure and the bliss of having modules that allows us to build big buildings, big software projects in a very short time, because we are reusing the effort of other people's contributions, so that the individual carpenters in a building will not spend less time knocking in a nail than before, but together we can build huge constructions in a very short time. And there's no question that open source is important for everyone. I mean, this is industry findings for 10 years back, and they still say that it's at that time it was even then important for many companies. And even companies that we think of as software vendors and monolithic companies, they also base a lot of their contributions from open source and to open source projects. For instance, Microsoft is the main sponsor of Hadoop. And I think Accenture got it wrong when they, in the same survey, found out that 98% of companies are using open source. I think 100% of companies are using it. So when Odysseas mentioned 75% of companies in Germany were positive to open source, I think the remaining 25%, they are just ignoring what they are using and what they are doing and what they need for their business. So I think we need to look at software as some kind of an infrastructure, and especially open source is an infrastructure for both companies and for Europe as such. So the first thing is that there is no profit in an infrastructure. So you have to realize that this is something that you can share, and you can maintain the infrastructure together with other people, and then it becomes cost efficient for you. And this allows you to build your own products on top of this infrastructure faster and better than you would otherwise do if you didn't have this infrastructure. So I think that we are sort of starting up in Europe today. We are using a lot of big open source projects, but these projects, they mostly are maintained, driven by out of Europe interests. And this is something which is a main concern and should be a concern for the European Commission. And I think that open source is essential, it's vital for SMEs and small and medium-sized enterprises in particular, because they do not have the resources to build their own software. They do not have the resources to themselves create what they need. So if they cannot base on a good infrastructure of open source libraries and projects, then their business will simply fail or never start. So for Europe, I have sort of some hopes and some missions. First of all, I hope that we can think about software as an infrastructure, and we jointly need to find a strategy for what we should have in order to fill the gaps which are currently in the market of open source software. The European Commission
is down.
The presentation is down. Okay. Let me then share it again. Okay. Oh, can you see it now?
Yes, it's perfect. Good.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that the European Commission, I will challenge the European Commission to actually take ownership. They need a strategy not only for how to use open source inside the European Commission and the importance of their own contributions to open source, but they need a strategy for the whole of Europe, so we all can see how Europe can contribute to the open source landscape. And of course, we should not reinvent the wheel, so there is no point in contributing to projects that already exist and are perfectly viable, but we need to create new projects that can fill those gaps. And that means we have to think about reuse and ecosystems. There is no point in a single European project developing a nice library that will not be maintained beyond that end of the project, because there is no ecosystem that uses that library, and there is no incentives for others to use that library. So ideally, I think that the European Commission should ask new projects to build on top of existing libraries and existing results from other projects, and discuss how they will do that. And when building libraries, I think we should think about libraries for all. And when I say all here, I think about all languages, because we in computer science, we have a disease that we tend to develop our own language. So you're not a real computer scientist unless you have developed a language, which is a very wrong way to think, because that means we have a huge fragmentation in terms of libraries. Think about numerical software, for instance. LINPACK and BLAS are available for everyone to use, and that means this is some kind of infrastructure that we need in many different branches, and it should be interfaced by many different languages. And finally, we should think about the coming of high performance computing, which basically means that we need to make sure that these libraries are working well on a single computer, on a single laptop, as much as they work well with GPUs or AI accelerators or in a high performance computing center. So that was my time. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Geir, for this very thorough presentation and great statement. I now pass the word to Peter Ngor Larsen, who is a professor at Aarhus University, Denmark, and he's a renowned project coordinator that I had the pleasure to work with on one project. And I really believe he's very great approach for management and coordination. And he is expert in cyber physical systems, both from industry and academia side. So Peter, to you.
Thank you, Andre. Thanks for the kind words as well. I should probably say that I've been working with open source since 2005. First as a convener of an open source initiative called Overture. But in relationship to European research projects, I've been the coordinator of a project called Into-CPS. And Into-CPS is a project where I actually managed to transfer all the rights of the tool chain being developed into an independent non-for-profit association. And I think that was hard work, but it's really worthwhile trying to do something like that in European projects, such that the research results live on from the time where you actually develop them. At the moment, I'm the coordinator of another project called HubCap, and HubCap is targeting to develop a cloud-based collaboration platform, in particular to target the SMEs in order to make it easier for them to get started with doing model-based development of cyber-physical systems. And I think that this is an interesting approach where you don't need to download things, but having things and be able to share, like Geir was just suggesting, share models, share tools, such that SMEs can get started in a fast manner. Naturally, there are issues with respect to licensing in terms of being able to use Windows and use other things in a cloud-based approach like this. But we'll try to see what are the limits of what can be done there. And I think that open source is going to be there to stay, not just for software, also for models that can be used in top of these software. So you have larger Lego building blocks. I would hope that we would see more European projects that actually make use of open source software and make it carry on after the project are actually complete. So that's my initial statement.
Thank you, Hans-Peter. So now I give word to my colleague, Alexandra Bagnato. She is head of research in Softeam, France. Softeam is a part of La Poste or DocaPost company. And she's been managing research for many years. He started with her research career in 90s, and she's a renowned manager for software technologies, cyber physical metrications. So, and I mean, I know for real that she's a proponent for open source. And now, Alessandra, please, your open statement. Back to you, Alessandra.
Oh, thank you very much, Andrei, for inviting me, for inviting us in that. And thank you, of course, to all the organizers to organize something like that, so important for Europe, so important for the world. Because, of course, open source software is there for us all, beyond states, beyond no boundaries, no frontiers. Open source is for everyone, researchers, company, individuals, getting together to improve the state of the art that is for the whole world. So thank you. Well, I am being involved in the open source from the earlier start of my career. During my thesis, I managed to, back in the 90s, as Andrei said, which makes me kind of old, but it's okay. Yeah, I started with an open source project. I was collaborating with this beautiful initiative, and I really love it. And since the 90s, I followed up that nice experience, and of course brought it to the many European projects where I worked. And in particular, I might say that since 2015, the European Commission started to fund many projects in that and to build really a very good framework for open source and to push us all to improve in that sense. So projects like OSMeter and CrossMiner have been funded also to evaluate what the open source can give us in terms of quality, because that is, of course, a very important factor. And one thing that I want to say, since I have this nice occasion to all the eager open source people that are here, is just to take care of some detail like the documentation, because we are doing such amazing work, and somehow sometimes it happens that we don't document it properly, and people cannot really have the opportunity to understand what we did. So that is just my little word to push for the future of open source, which of course has a long way to go, and which will stay with us a lot, because people like it, because the whole philosophy of sharing and helping each other is there. And of course, those are the philosophy that we all share in Europe, and I believe in many parts of the world. So what I really like for this is how open source bring together people from any kind corner of the world, and can really push to improve the state of the art in a very good way. What else to say? I think that somehow, if I can say something, a bit of guidance should be needed to help the eager people that work on open source, to help them just to focus their efforts, and just for this idea of documentation, and try to help in this direction. And I think that the initiative that have been done by European Commission during these years are really much going towards this direction. And as Geir said before, and Peter said before me, there are going to be great times for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. And now I give word to Dr. Bastian Koller. He is a manager at the High Performance Computing Center in Stuttgart. He has been working on high performance computing, architecture, software, big data, modeling, and all these areas where high performance computing is very much important. As you know, open source is quite in use in this area. And so it will be very great to hear from Bastian his take on open source and the importance of open source. Bastian, to you.
So hello, and thanks for the kind introduction. Yes, open source, it's something which appears, let's say, every time you're doing an EC project, you're getting, let's say, your impact section talking about open source, talking about, let's say, licenses and all the stuff. And for me, it's quite interesting because there are two kinds of people. Ones which are really heavily, let's say, interested in open source and know about what's going on there, and the other ones which just think about open source because they might get a benefit of talking about it. So I think it's very important that we understand what open source really means for us. And open source, let's say, you can have negative examples where from the HPC domain, you have some open source codes which are evolved there, and it's a lot of applications. But if still there's nobody really taking care of this, and this gets like what I usually call the community code out of hell, then after a while it's obsolete and you have to have heavy investments afterwards to get this back on track somehow. So this is the thing which I have to face in my time. So open source is very important, but I think what we have to go there, and let's say, talking from my experience now, 16 years in EC projects, I've seen a lot of things coming and going there. I think we need to have somehow a mechanism for open source which supports us into sustainability of those codes and of those people. And the problem is many things are done by students or people which are there and then they go somewhere else. So ideally they transfer the knowledge. If it doesn't work like that, somehow it's getting less involvement. If the community is not big enough, it's getting less, etc., and it's gotten forgotten. In many cases, when we do projects, we think about the things we know. So we are aware of open source software X, Y, Z, and we try to base on this. But there might be something different. We say there's always the distinction, what do I use, etc. So what I've learned is that probably a mix of development and then consolidation phase would be great. And the question is, to what do we consolidate? So let me give you an example. We just talked about the EPI. We will have the European processor. Yes, it's very important, and it will be open and openly based on, let's say, the available bits by ARM and the available bits by the RISC-V developments. So why not going, for instance, then saying, okay, this is the HPC processor, but it's not an HPC processor per se, because it will be something which needs to be much more broad, or let's say at the end, nobody will make money out of this, and they still want to make money out of this. They will not share it for free. So the question is, other unit, cloud unit, why not working on a European hypervisor for these things, for instance? Why not working on a middleware for these things, etc., and bringing the whole things together and see, let's say, put some effort into saying, okay, where are we now? So we have the developments X for the EPI. We have developments here for middlewares. We have a lot of variety of projects on middlewares, hypervisors, etc. And then really identify the gaps here and work on closing the gaps together with these communities. So feeding it back into the communities but still, and this is very important, still keeping the door open that some companies, etc., might make use of these derivatives and provide additional bits on a commercial license part. So I usually compare this with the codecs we had, like in the video player, good old times, starting Windows things, media player. You had codecs which were for free, and you had codecs which were, let's say, commercial, still being able to be plugged into the thing, but giving you more bits. And this would be the, let's say, it would gain the interest also of a lot of commercial institutions to invest here, to do something like a pre-competitive development, supporting the community, being able at a certain point in time to take parts of that and to transfer this into a commercial project. And I think if we are getting this right and getting the mechanisms there to have some sort of a steering there, or let's say a monitoring and this consolidation phase after some years, then I think we could process much further in that direction. So I try to keep short, which is always hard for me, I know.
Okay, thank you very much, Bastian. Very, very interesting take on from the HPC community. Now I'm going to give word to Dr. Jesus Miguel Ruano Lopez. He's a principal investigator in cyber security in Ikerlan, Spain. And he's actually prepared a very nice presentation on his take. about IoT, industrial cybersecurity, Industry 4.0. So, Jesus, with that, I give you the word.
All right.
You own.
All right. Thank you very much. Do you see the screen properly?
Yes. Yes,
right.
we see it properly. Thank you.
Excellent. So good morning all. Thank you very much, Andre, for the kind invitation. Today I'm going to talk about open source software and how can be balanced into a huge challenge that we are facing, which is IT-OT convergence. So it is actually these two sentences are a kind of a personal view to prevent ICT commoditization, which is something I'm going to talk about. Because nowadays, I believe that the smart systems, CPS, and ICT components are becoming a commodity. And that's something that it means that it's no longer evaluated by performance, but is much more evaluated by price. And I got the feeling that this is happening also in the ICT community. So we need to fight against this commoditization. And how we are going to sort this out, I'm going to propose you through this talk a story, because storytelling is a powerful tool. So I'm going to start with introduction, a set of actions, climax, and impact and resolution. So let's get into this, and this is going to do something with this Mars robot that has what this has to do with open source software. So we'll discover at the end. So the introduction. It's clear that ICT commoditization is coming. It's clear that ICT is seen as a commodity, similar as how a house or office building project will be implementing electricity and plumbing. Know-how that is transmitted to competitors via tools leads to rapid commoditization, and sustainable innovation does not prevent the commoditization. So that's why the opportunity and the challenges is through first marketing, obviously, like Apple does, but also through disruptive innovation. So through adding value to the solutions that we have. And I think that this disruptive innovation can be oriented through a huge challenge that we are facing, which is IT-OT convergence. Why this IT-OT convergence is needed? Because we need to have interoperable, scalable, and integrated solutions of the IT world and the OT, which is nowadays more and more connected. So in terms of cybersecurity, this is an issue, a huge issue. So we need to mix all these components together well and to make them interact properly. So this is a clear challenge that we are facing. And how we can sort this out, or I propose 5 actions in order to make these technologies more relevant. So the step 1, to redefine smart. That's something that I'm not going to be the first one to is trying to work on what is to be intelligent. From my point of view, to be intelligent, or the skill called intelligence, is the ability of a system to learn how to improve his performance against the uncertainties of a changing environment during his complete life cycle. So what kind of systems have this skill? Those systems that can transform themselves, that can change and evolve, and they can be called complex systems or agent-based systems. So that's something that we need to keep in mind in order to move on through this ICT, in order to avoid this commoditization. So what is step 2? To embrace complexity. To realize, I mean, I'm not going to say anything new, but it is clear that the models that we've been working with have been changing. And we started with mechanical models in 17th century, and then with statistical models, and then with system models. And all these models can make this simulation of what we call IT-OT convergence of all these worlds. And however, we cannot make them we cannot arrange them into a kind of a static, regulated protocol. Like nothing novel can emerge from systems with high degrees of order and stability. And on the contrary, complete chaos or complete chaotic systems such as Stamdes, riots, rage, or the early year of the French Revolution are too formless to coalesce. So we need to find a compromise, something in the middle. So I believe that the generative complexity takes place in the boundary between the regularity and randomness. So in the edge of chaos. So is So is open source software the edge of chaos? It might be. It might be this kind of right balance between chaos and fixed and regulated technologies. So step 3, the integration of updating capabilities as a mutation strategy. It is clear that updating protocols are a key element into performance nowadays in terms of cybersecurity and in terms of performance itself. So if we keep in mind, for example, at Ickerland, we keep in mind that we all have these elements into an ICT system, and we need to balance them. We need to merge them together properly. And in order to do that, we need a continuous improvement cycle, like a quality cycle. So through this updating is a strategy to continuously improving this protocol in an intelligent way, into a learning process in order to adapt to these uncertainties of the environment. So that's also a key part. So step 4 is network architecture, cybersecure edge computing. These updating issues, all these convergence need to be taken into account that cybersecurity is a must. Why is a must? Because trust is an essential element. As Yuval Noah Harari says, trust is the raw material from which all types of businesses are minted. So we need to make sure that all these convergence and all these elements are well associated and well combined in order to create a secure environment, a cybersecurity. We have at Ickerland divided this cybersecurity in 2 parts: in cybersecure embedded systems, from the sensors to the IoT, and from the IoT to the data analytics into cybersecure IoT digital platforms. So we believe that we are able to create a trusted cyber solution for industry. So in step 5 and the final one, Internet of Processes versus Internet of Things. We believe that reality is made of processes, is not made of things. And through this paradigm, we can change the way that we proceed, the way that we not only develop our projects, but also maintain the products of our customers. So we are creating an organic growth in order to create a solution that adapts to the environment. And this environment might change. So what are the solutions? As the climax of this story, the climax is an architecture and a network configuration in a particular one. The first part is not very new for you. So it's something like a model-based agent, a configuration where we have 3 modes of working: fast computing, learning computing, and thorough computing, where this complex system is gathering information from the surroundings and is having changes, and these changes are measured, and the actor takes actions, kind of reflex way. On the other hand, we have changes in this complex system where we are in a learning process, where these changes are feeding a world simulator, a learning element, and is simulating possible solutions in the future. And then we have a complex systems where thorough computing is taking place, where these surrounding changes are never seen before in this complex system, and we need to simulate and to make some estimations of what's supposed to be the most appropriate solution or the most appropriate outcome. So this world simulator makes some inferior commands and then takes place into the solution. So this is something that we are exploring currently. And one of our particular ideas is this fractal arrangement of the edge computing. What we are trying and we are proposing is an architecture where, independently of the point of view where we are looking at these systems, we always seen this configuration. So independently of if this set of nodes are an airport or are a building or maybe just a company, airport company, airplane company, independently of that, we are always seeing this system of systems. And that's something that we want to introduce this configuration in order to increase our interoperability, our scalability, and as well, as I mentioned before, the OT-IT integration.
Jesus, probably some closing remark on open source. We'll need to start like to go to the next discussion process. If I may, we may suggest we go to for the questions answers. And thank you for this for this on IoT and security and open source. We will have to go on discussions so that yeah, so we continue in this format. For the audience, I actually encourage you to post your questions in the chat. So you may actually ask Jesus Miguel and other presenters, and so I will manage to like speak loud your questions. And now I'm going to I'm going to the speakers on the panel, and I actually will ask some provocative questions to you, so that's we can actually discuss and share your our opinions. So we see that open source is a boost for innovation. I mean, now it's more affordable to build up new products based on the open source components. But in the same time, for those who build the tools, for example, that's actually a great competition from the open source. And so while this is great competition, the kind of providers for the open source tools, let's say in components, sorry, not that open source tools and components need to low prices, right, for their tools, and actually brings them out of the business at some point. You see, so in this value chain, the producers of the end products benefit because they sell the products and they use like tools for free. But what for the other people in the value chain? Could they also get something from the open source? So I propose we go in the rounds as we did before for the statement, and just to try to elaborate on that question. So I would start with Geir. Geir, what is your take on open source and innovation as such?
I think this is, thank you, Andrea. I think this is often seen as contradictions, that you have open source and that you cannot make money from it. I think the core idea, and there is a lesson to be learned from when they created Ubuntu, because there was a company that used to maintain their own operating system. And of course, they didn't make money about this. And what they really made money from was what the software they had on top of this operating system. And then open sourcing their sort of non-profitable things would enable them to make more money from what they could focus on, their real business. So it's the same as a legal company. Lawyers are writing a lot of text, but they're not developing text editors to do that. So they use text editors in order to make their own business running. So I would say that if you make business in an area where there is an open source alternative, an infrastructure based on open source available, you are in the wrong area. So that's actually a sound thing that you have struggling in that case. On the other hand, we also see that there is some kind of a shift towards mass consummation. So you have to think that if you want to make money, your product must be of such a kind that it needs tailoring for your clients or needs specification for your clients. Otherwise, it is actually some part of an infrastructure and it should be open source. So I think that as long as we think this way, then also people and companies will be more inclined to support open source projects, because that's a crucial part of their products, at the bottom of the products, as part of their infrastructure. And then they should support the open source and ensure that it evolves as we get new hardware, as we get new cyber physical systems, as we get new applications. Also the basis and the infrastructure need to evolve and take that into account. So I think using open source as a natural part of your product is also an incentive for companies to contribute back to open source. And it's not a contradiction between being innovative and make money from closed source on top of open source, provided that the licenses, of course, allow that to happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Geir, for this answer. Peter, I know you are businessman and some kind with the tool of Overture for many years, and into CPS association is also bound to open source, but also makes innovation and, let's say, business out of the open source. To you, open source is the booster, the driver, or it is a kind of barrier for innovation? So what would be your take? So is it compatible, innovation and open source?
So in my view, I think the key to success in open source is either that you have a business that supports the open source thing, like AdaCore is doing on Ada and other support tools like this, or you have an association that owns the right to things, but the members, if they are members at the right level, they can actually use the open source code inside closed source solutions such that it's a fair deal. I mean, the people putting time into developing these open source things, they can actually both make money out of it, but they can also freely do research further in this direction. And as a researcher, of course, that was important to me, but I think it's fair that companies can be making success out of doing this. And that's the reason why I think kind of the core thing that makes this possible is to have associations that are non-for-profit as such, but they can actually enhance and embrace both the open sourceness and the innovation at the same time.
Okay, now turn to Alexandra. I know you work in a company that successfully combines open source and commercial development for more than 8 years. What is your take on innovation and open source? Right, so you're now muted.
Thank you, sorry. So, well, I believe that open source is very much state of the art for innovation. What they call maintenance, the sustainable business model, very much adapted to this philosophy and this way of working, because actually this openness that is in the open source way of work is really guaranteeing for many difficulties that can arrive to different companies for different reasons. So that also arrange the sustainability aspects of these business models, as Peter was mentioning before. So I believe that companies have very good advantages of using this approach. Of course, they are a bit different from the usual way of, let's say, making money. But of course, they are working, as you said. We have, of course, my company having this approach, but many others. And we, as citizens, as users, we are using open source tools every day without even knowing. And so every user has this way of using, and companies that are having this approach are benefit from training, consultancies, and well, the typical business model. But they are also paving the way of a sustainability approach, because actually sharing this code let them be ready, for example, for potential bugs that may be discovered by a broader community, potential security issue, and of course, what is very important nowadays, the trustability of what is done. So people needs and wants to trust what they are using. And of course, having an open source software is the better way to trust something. You really see what is it. You can really check how things are done, and if they are convenient for you, for your needs. if the security is well taken care of. And basically we had this problem of security with this new COVID way of work in many aspects of the tools we were using. We all have these kind of problems. And what emerges is that, of course, if you can have the source code of data, you are sure that everything works as it should, and it provides more guarantee. So very sustainable. So what I said is the innovation is there, will be even more there with open source, and the sustainability of the approach is what will make it bigger and stronger. That's all.
Thank you. Bastian, okay, from high performance computing point of view, is it a barrier or it is a boost to innovation? I know high performance computing and open source, this is actually fit together very much. So is it a boost?
I think in many cases it's a boost. It really depends on what you're doing with the stuff. So let's say if you have an open source operating system, it's very good. Usually you still have to pay a lot of money for the consultancy from people there. So there's a good business model for those. But you start on a certain, say, level, and honestly, open source is does not always equal open source. So it really depends on what you're working on, how mature the thing is, what community is behind the bits, etc. So we see, I'm just running a European Center of Excellence on engineering applications, and we worked on 6 reference applications. Some of them open source, some of them, let's say, rather commercial. The commercial one is usually the discussion. So what will happen with the results within the project? How do we distribute this? How, let's say, do we open that? On the other hand, one of the codes now disappeared because the developers just decided to stop it, which usually doesn't happen, let's say, when you have really community and a commercial background in this and it's successful. So it's a balance of both. As I say, I think the good part is really that if we start basing on open source, first of all, it's also easy with to exchange with the others using the same thing there on a much more open way, and it's much more transparent to see what's happening in the background. But again, still, open source is not open source, and you should be very careful. And this is something I see a lot happening also in projects, that people are often not aware that open source doesn't mean that I can really sell it immediately as I want there. So it really depends on the license. It's let's say for people which I used to work with this, it's a no-brainer, but a lot of people say, okay, then we use this and this is open source, and then I can make a product out of this, and then they run into trouble with the licensing at the end. So then somehow stopped in that regard because of legal issues, and I think this is very important also to take into account here.
Thank you, Bastian. So now it's time for Jesus Miguel. And Jesus Miguel, so I mean, you're a cybersecurity expert, right? And open source, innovation, and cybersecurity. How does fit? Because I mean, there is always like some concerns about the quality of the open source. Like Bastian mentioned, that there might be some concerns from like people going out of the project stopped, and then so that may bring some challenges for cybersecurity. So what other kind of
I think it's very complex question, and it's difficult to answer. My view is it will depend on as it was mentioned before, it's a matter of licensing as well. Independently if it's open or not, you have some rights on what you are doing. And it is clear that those things need to be clearly defined. And nowadays, what I think is that there are technologies, are getting more and more technologies in order to set a tool of arrangements like blockchain, for example, in order to establish some relationships between some partners and others, and to make sure that these arrangements are being fulfilled properly. Maybe it's possible to use technology to make sure that this is happening properly. So it is a difficult task, but it is possible it is all about trust, as I said before. Trust in the supply chain, because we need to make sure that all the actors involved in this chain are something to win. and maybe through smart contracts, maybe through evaluating if you are making a contribution, that this contribution is having an effect in the performance of the product. Maybe you are going to take back some profit, for example. I'm not business expert. I'm just thinking of ways of taking advantage of your contribution.
Right, thank you. Also, I mean, we can have second round of questions, answers, or you can actually like discuss or comment. People said today, like Odysseus and other coordinators on this panel. So, but one of the topics I'd like to discuss with you, starting with Geir, is how like the heavy industry that we have in Europe, like the very big companies, how they approach the open source. Because from my experience, I mean, we had lots of discussions with lawyers about what kind of licenses are could be used or not to be used. But it is a very headache to deal with lawyers, basically. In these big companies, I mean, to get them accept that like engineers would need some open source software. There is that some kind of paradigm shift, and it's going actually be much easier in the future, or this is actually something that couldn't be overcome, let's say. I would start with Geir. What is your take on perspective of open source in the like heavy industry and the big companies?
Well, I think as you did already, you have to separate between what we can call the legal part and the engineering part, because the engineering part is certainly aware of open source, they push for it, but they are restricted by restrictive and old-fashioned lawyers. And I think that there are two answers to this. One is that, first of all, the power balance in the company has to be sort of shifted towards agility and the future, rather than lawyers that always tend to look in the rearview mirror and actually make money from discussing things and then talking about things rather than doing and building things. And I hope that, for instance, a situation of crisis will sort of stimulate that also big companies now will focus more on innovation, agility, and time to market, rather than spending infinite time on discussing legal topics. That's one thing. I also think there is a sort of common response from Europe to this, and this is why I raised the issue about the European Union public license, because this is not very much used. And I think that if we in Europe get the sort of common agreed understanding among legal people that this license would enable them to also exploit open source in commercial software, then they would actually see the benefit of it, because that will allow a larger security and risk avoidance for the big companies to be able to reuse open source, because they can fix it if the original developers are not able to fix a bug, or they can inspect the software to see that it doesn't do anything harmful to their other products on top of it. But again, we need the legal framework and the legal assurance that, given that this software is based on a well-known license that everyone knows about, then that is sort of solving the issue. Because now many lawyers, especially in big industries, they've heard about GPL and think that GPL is dangerous, because then all of their own software has to be open source. And of course, yes, that's true, but there are other licenses that are less restrictive and allow commercial exploitation and integration with own software. And this is what we need to promote, sort of.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. So you have huge industry experience working for major companies in aeronautic. So what is your take about open source? I mean, from this experience perspective.
So in addition to what Geir just said about the legal side of things, I think that the main obstacles for getting open source used is when the maturity of it is not high enough and the guarantees for the maintenance is not high enough. So if you are, as a large organization, trying to rely on a piece of open source software, you need to have certain guarantees that you can expect it to be maintained when a bug is being issued or being found and reported. So I think that the best open source solutions are actually where it's possible to have either a company that commercially supports it, or having the ability that you can use the open source software inside your own products, and therefore the licensing thing in terms of GNU public license and other things is so important to make sure that this has a chance of flying. But other than that, I mean, large organizations use open source software, but they are struggling to what they are allowed to use because of these other things in terms of licensing. But the key corner to it is really if it's being properly maintained and it's high quality, they will use it.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. So, I mean, I know you have big clients for your software, and also is it somehow restricted within big companies? So, please.
I think that actually, as Peter said, big companies cares a lot on what they are installing on their workstation, on their post of work. That of course, because of security, because of many issues that are inside the company. So the trustability of what they are using is absolutely important. So the quality, the fact that this open source software is free of bugs, is free of security issue. They don't want to harm their own ecosystem. So that is very important, that the maturity level, as Peter said, is quite advanced, and that this product that they are installing is well known, well used, and if there is a consultancy company behind it to help in case, that is of course a major help. I also agree with Geir about the European Union license. That of course would be a great help, because it will set a common framework, and the company will know where they are heading to, which helps. Because actually companies are, when they are selecting the proper open source software component, they are of course taking care of these details, and they don't want to invest in using a certain open source component and then having this time and money of course lost, because the open source is not anymore supported, because it has so bigger bugs or security issues that it cannot be used anymore. So I think the investment should be on that side. Thank you.
Your mic, Andrew.
I had done.
You are muted.
So, yeah. Yes, I actually like I was hosting, like losing my rights to unmute myself, so it's not that good. Okay. Anyways, Bastian, yes. High performance computing industry open source. So would industry accept open source? I mean, there is a lot of GPL actually in those kind of virtualization technologies and stuff. So, and this is how somehow restrictive, yeah. And so, I mean, in Germany, I know there is huge concern on GPL within the kind of biggest industries that around your Stuttgart area. So, yeah, is it like kind of shifting somehow? So whether they will kind of more accepting open source and like, yeah, please.
So, it usually depends on what you're doing with the open source software. So we have a lot of industrial users which use open source software for the developments. So they are not integrated, but they're using them as tools. Let's say the software as such. So then they are very interested in this, and ideally they're very interested also in getting some consultancy out of around that. If they use open source, let's say for their products and integrate this somehow, what we see usually happening is that, first of all, what they want to see are success stories from somewhere. So it's very important that they have seen it work somewhere with, let's say, an example which should be different from the, now being nasty, classical research project example where it's more or less a bit of a fuzzy thing, etc. But I want to see some competitor ideally really using that and being, let's say, coming back to the matter of being trustworthy and reliable, and then obviously also secure that. In the worst case for the open source software community itself, at a certain point in time, they decide to invest in contributing to this community heavily with their own developers, etc., which usually leads them to an enemy takeover at a certain point in time, and they simply buy it in that regard. So we've seen this happening with some applications where suddenly they're integrated into Siemens and some other stuff there, and then obviously the whole business model around that changes immediately in that regard, and they keep a bit of the open source part alive for a while so that the community doesn't complain too much, and at a certain point in time it's getting from market. But at the end, I say it still depends really on who's behind the communities and who's driving how the communities, and if people, it starts with the people behind steering that community, because open source doesn't mean that everybody is doing what he/she wants. It really depends on, let's say, the whole setup of the frame in that the open source is developed.
Thank you very much, Bastian. Jesus needs to leave right now, so we're closing the session. We invite him to probably for one closing remark. If you can ask something from European Commissions for the open source, so what would be this one thing?
For me, it's guys.
Oh, sorry. Jesus would actually need to.
Yes, but could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, if there were kind of one thing that you can ask from European Commission with regard to open source, so what that would be?
Maybe to let them to explore more possibilities, not maybe looking for so short-term impact, and maybe asking, being aware of that these technologies require a maturity, but not only in technology, but also in business models and business arrangements. And we believe that, for example, in terms of cybersecurity, this has a lot of open source solutions has a lot of advantages. So it is a matter of keep pushing, and we will find out the right models and the right business protocols.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. By Jesus, back to Geir and the other presenters. Just one closing word about what one thing from European Commission you can ask for like open source and your area, let's say. So
yes,
starting with Geir.
So my message is develop a strategy for European open source outside of the Commission, and follow it and create successes like Fireware, where you support the open source platform being built over a sequence of projects.
Okay, thank you. Peter, you?
Well, I think my statement would be that the European Commission should maybe try to support projects in establishing things that can go and enable the new research results being used open source wise after the project, and kind of this kind of association thing which requires legal advice. And I've done it twice. It's a lot of work, but I think it's the same kind of work that needs to be done every time. And if the European Commission was supporting that, we would get more out of the research results we produce.
Thank you. Very, very valuable. Alexandra, one thing from European Commission that would help ease your life to open source.
I think that, on my side, I think it will be much more the legal aspects that could be helped on the European Commission side, because, for example, having a common European license, that would be nice and would solve some of the many headache that the company might have on analyzing the license. And of course, it will push a bit more our position as Europe in that. And then, of course, having the European Commission in the open source is already a big point. I mean, for the whole work, for the trustability of the approach. So that simple fact is already very good.
Good. Right. So some closing words from Bastian, please.
The wish list to Santa Claus or to the European Commission. I think what I said in the beginning is, I think the work programs should integrate a consolidation phase to ensure that after this consolidation phase, the fundings are going into support of sustainable developments on base of what has been done before. So we should stop the complete fragmentation of results, because it will not be convincing for many industrials to take it up if I have 10 solutions giving me each part of my overall solution I need. And if I could wish something for myself, then try to join forces with the API people and try to work on a European hypervisor.
Okay, very good take. So now we will be closing. Just probably one small question to Odysseas from European Commission. If he has any kind of small like 30 seconds remark.
Yeah, thank you, Andre, and thank you all the colleagues in the panel for their fruitful discussion, and also for their very useful recommendations concerning what the European Commission can do. I would agree with all of them. I cannot say how and when this could be implemented, but definitely we still have issues with the sustainability of the results, on the licensing, on security. But we need to see also all these aspects in the context of the new policy initiatives, in order to make sure that we would make all open source actions relevant for the policy initiatives. And also for Bastian, yes, we're having these discussions. And I was laughing when you're making these recommendations, smiling, exactly because we have written several papers and notes to the management on this. So you may be surprised sometimes of what you see in the future. And as a final remark from my side, I would like just to mention that only yesterday, Eclipse Foundation announced that they are moving to Europe. And for me, this is, and of course, this is not out of surprise for us, because we have discussion with them and we've been asked about this. But for me, this is also a message that we may also see another shift. Because up to now we have seen foundations and initiatives starting in Europe moving to the US, and now we may see the restaurant, and that will be very good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Odysseas. Thank you all the panelists and all the audience for the nice questions. So we had some questions for Juan. I will pass it by. For Jesus Miguel, and he left also his email address in case you want to ask him something. Now I actually switch to transfer to the next session and next chairs to Alberto Siliti, Shahista, and others, and also to Artyom, who will be chairing that. Yeah, so please stay tuned and follow us on Facebook and Telegram. Back to Artyom. Artyom, please announce the next session, or what will be next.